The offices of Thornton Timber Company occupied the entire top floor of the Denver Mercantile Building, a testament to the empire Jackson Thornton had built from nothing. October sunshine slanted through tall windows, illuminating polished oak desks, leather chairs, and the enormous wall map marked with thousands of acres of Colorado and Wyoming timberland. Jackson sat behind his desk, examining ledgers with the same precision that had once made him a formidable cavalry officer. At 42, success had etched itself into every line of his face. "Quite a bargain at 8,000, Victor Hayes said, tapping a long finger against the map where 10,000 acres of virgin forest lay marked in red. Union Pacific is practically giving it away. Jackson nodded, studying the topographical features of the land he'd purchased sight unseen. Railroads overextended after the '73 crash. They need liquid capital more than land assets. Victor smiled, revealing teeth too perfect to be natural. At 48, he maintained the appearance of a younger man with dyed hair and expensive tailoring. His Brooks Brothers three-piece suit and gold pocket watch chain communicated wealth as clearly as a banner. "And will sell to Colorado Central Mining for triple within 6 months," Victor continued. 30,000 profit for signing a few papers. "This is why we're partners, Jackson. You find value where others see only trees." Jackson closed the ledger. "I'll ride out tomorrow to survey the property." Victor's smile faltered. "Is that necessary? The deed's clear. We don't need to waste time on inspection." "I don't invest in what I haven't seen with my own eyes." Victor shrugged, accustomed to his partner's peculiarities. "As you wish. Just don't become attached to the scenery. It's an asset, not a national park." After Victor departed, Jackson stood at the window overlooking Denver. The city had grown explosively since the silver boom, sprawling across the plains toward the foothills. He owned one of the largest homes in Cherry Creek, 3 thriving lumber mills, and controlled timber rights across 2 states. His personal worth approached $2.5 million, a fortune that would have seemed impossible to the orphan boy he'd once been. Yet each evening he returned to an empty mansion, taking dinner alone at a table meant for 20. The servants maintained a respectful distance, sensing something dangerous in their employer's solitude. Jackson had cultivated that distance deliberately. Attachment was vulnerability. Vulnerability was weakness. These were lessons he'd learned young and hard. That night, Jackson stood before his bedroom mirror, examining the jagged scar that ran from his right temple to jawline. 16 years had passed since Gettysburg, but he could still smell the gunpowder, hear the screams of men and horses. The Confederate cavalry charge had nearly taken his life. Instead, it had taken only his face and what remained of his faith in humanity. As he traced the scar with his fingertips, he remembered the young lieutenant who had fought beside him, whose body he had carried from the field after the battle. The boy had died calling for his mother. Jackson had survived only to wake in a field hospital with half his face reconstructed and a lesson seared into his soul. Survival belonged to those who depended on no one. Dawn broke crisp and cold as Jackson rode out from Denver toward the high country. Diablo, his black Appaloosa stallion, moved with the confident stride of a horse that had carried its master through war and peace. The animal had been with Jackson since the final year of fighting, a former cavalry mount that understood commands by the slightest pressure of knees or shift of weight. Jackson traveled light but prepared. His worn McClellan saddle held essential supplies. The Colt Peacemaker on his hip had accompanied him since the war's end, and the Winchester Model 1873 in its scabbard contained the reliability he valued in all things. His black duster and Stetson warded off the autumn chill as the elevation increased. By midday, he reached the ridge overlooking his newest acquisition. 10,000 acres of pine forest stretched before him like a fortress, dark, dense, profitable. The land rolled away in waves of evergreen, broken occasionally by meadows turned amber in the autumn light. Mountains rose purple and imposing against a sky sharp as cut crystal. Jackson's hand drifted to the Hamilton Railway pocket watch in his vest. The gold timepiece was the only possession he'd salvaged from his childhood, a gift from his father on his 12th birthday. 3 months later, both his parents were dead, and Jackson learned that time was the most merciless force in existence. A thin column of smoke spiraled upward from the valley below, drawing his attention. Jackson frowned. Smoke meant people. People meant complications. He nudged Diablo forward, descending the ridge with measured caution. As the valley opened before him, Jackson spotted the source of the smoke. A small log cabin nestled against the tree line, weathered and humble. Outside, an elderly man swung an axe with methodical precision, splitting logs with practiced efficiency despite his years. Beside him, a woman of similar age stacked the wood, her movements slow but determined. Jackson approached without haste, allowing his presence to announce itself naturally. The rhythmic sound of the axe ceased. The old man straightened, wiping sweat from his brow, despite the autumn chill. He was 70th a day, but his eyes remained clear and alert. "Afternoon," Jackson said, his voice neutral. He did not dismount. "Afternoon to you," the man replied, leaning on his axe handle. The Springfield 1860 felling axe had seen years of use, its handle polished smooth by calloused hands. "You're on private property," Jackson stated flatly. The old man nodded once, neither surprised nor intimidated. "Name's Henry Harrison, sir. This here's my wife, Elizabeth." He gestured toward the woman who had paused in her work, watching the exchange with quiet intensity. "Jackson Thornton," he replied out of ingrained courtesy. "I hold title to this land, all 10,000 acres." "Been working this patch 3 seasons now," Henry said, his speech carrying the cadence of Appalachia. "Since old Thirlwall went belly up and Major Jenkins from the railroad gave us his word we could stay on as caretakers. Railroad sold the land. I bought it fair and legal. Have the deed from the Denver land office." Elizabeth Harrison stepped forward then, a woman of perhaps 68 with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. Despite her age and the simplicity of her calico dress, she carried herself with unmistakable dignity. "We've planted apple trees," she said quietly, her Pennsylvania Dutch background evident in her precise diction. "Put in a small garden. Winter comes early in these mountains." Jackson remained impassive, though something in the woman's steady gaze made him uncomfortable. Her eyes flicked toward the cabin, then back to him. Something in that glance, fear perhaps, or pleading, made him pause. 2 weeks, Jackson said, surprising himself with the concession. "Finish your harvest. I'll pay $40 for the labor. Then you're gone." $40 was twice a miner's monthly wage, a generous offer by any standard, yet the look that passed between the elderly couple spoke of more than financial concerns. Henry nodded slowly. "Fair enough, Mr. Thornton. We'll be gone by first snow." Jackson turned Diablo, preparing to ride the 20 miles back to his ranch. As he did, he noticed the cabin again. The smoke poured from the chimney, too much smoke for 2 old people. And there, just barely audible on the wind, he heard voices high and young carried across the clearing. Elizabeth Harrison watched him, hands twisting her apron in a gesture that planted unease in his chest. Jackson rode away without looking back. He'd bought the land. He'd offered fair wages. That was the end of it. But the image of Elizabeth's worried eyes followed him all the way home. 1 week later, Jackson returned. The afternoon sun hung low, turning the valley gold and cold. Henry worked alone, his axe striking timber in the same steady rhythm. No sign of Elizabeth. "Where's your wife?" Jackson asked, dismounting. Henry's face tightened. "Fever took her 3 days back. She's resting." Jackson had seen frontier fevers kill quickly. "I'll check on her." "No need, sir. She's—" But Jackson was already walking toward the cabin. Henry followed, too slow to stop him. Jackson pushed open the weathered door and stepped into revelation. 11 children stared back at him. They ranged from a toddler clinging to a teenage girl's skirt to a boy of 14 who stood protectively in front of the others. They slept on straw pallets lining the walls. A meager fire barely warmed the single cramped room. Elizabeth lay on a cot in the corner, fever flushed but awake. Her eyes met Jackson's, not with shame but with quiet defiance. No one spoke. The silence pressed against Jackson's chest like a physical weight. He counted them again. 11. Impossible. This cabin could barely hold 4 people, let alone 13. "Orphans," Henry said softly from the doorway. "Parents dead from disease. Mine accidents. Childbirth. Town won't take them. County wants to separate them. Send them to institutions. We do what we can." Jackson's throat felt thick. The oldest girl, maybe 14, stirred a pot of thin soup. The youngest child, barely 3, watched Jackson with enormous dark eyes. They were clean despite their poverty, quiet despite their fear. "How long?" Jackson's voice came out hoarse. 2 years for some, 3 months for the baby." Elizabeth spoke from her cot, voice weak but firm. "We don't ask for charity, Mr. Thornton. Just don't tell the county. They'll separate them, break them apart like kindling." Jackson backed out of the cabin without responding. His hands shook as he mounted Diablo. He rode 50 yards, then stopped. Behind him, a child began to cry soft, hopeless. The sound of someone who'd learned tears changed nothing. He'd seen poverty before, written checks for it, donated to church funds and orphan societies, but he'd never stood inside it, never breathed its air, never felt it watching him with children's eyes, waiting to see if he was another adult who'd walk away. Jackson sat motionless on his horse as the sun set and the temperature dropped. Then he turned back. That night, Jackson sat in his ranch house study 20 miles away. Firelight danced across leather chairs and walls lined with ledgers documenting his empire. Outside, wind rattled the windows. A storm was building early, fierce, deadly. The bourbon sat untouched beside him. He kept seeing the toddler's face, the exact age he'd been when the fire took his parents. He was 12. The ranch house had burned in the night, his father trying to save the horses, his mother screaming his name. Neighbors pulled Jackson back as the roof collapsed. By morning, he was an orphan. His Uncle Richard took him in, fed him, clothed him, educated him in the cold mathematics of business. But Uncle Richard never once called him son, never offered warmth or affection. You're here out of duty, boy. Don't expect love. Love is a luxury for people who can afford to be weak. Jackson learned to bury emotion like bodies in winter ground. He built wealth as armor against vulnerability. 30 years of careful distance. 30 years of telling himself he was strong because he was alone. Now those 11 children had shattered that lie in a single glance. He knew what waited for them if the county intervened. Institutional care meant labor farms children worked until 18, received minimal education, suffered abuses no one investigated. He knew because he'd endured a gentler version, a roof without love, food without family. The blizzard hit at midnight. Wind howled like something dying. Snow piled against the windows. That cabin couldn't survive winter with that many souls. At dawn, Jackson saddled Diablo. He loaded supplies, lumber, nails, dried goods, blankets. No plan except presence. No strategy except staying. Not my problem, he'd told himself for 30 years. But the lie wouldn't hold anymore. He'd been 12 once, watching adults walk away. Watching them choose comfort over courage. He wouldn't be another one who left. If that cabin was going to stand through winter, it needed more than wages. It needed a carpenter. And maybe, though the thought terrified him, it needed a father. Jackson rode into the storm toward 11 children who'd learned not to hope. This time he wasn't leaving. 3 weeks later, the valley had transformed. Jackson's expensive coat hung on a nail beside Henry's patched jacket. Lumber stacks surrounded the cabin. New walls rose against the sky. The millionaire and the farmer swung hammers in rhythm, breath clouding the cold air. For 21 days, Jackson had stayed, and the children had stopped flinching when he moved. As the cabin abandoned, Jackson came to know each child as an individual, not simply as part of the faceless mass of orphans he'd first encountered. They emerged as distinct souls, each carrying their own burdens and hopes. Sarah, the eldest girl at 14, watched him with narrowed eyes, her red hair pulled back in a practical braid. She'd taken charge of the younger children after her parents died from tuberculosis 2 years before. Trust did not come easily to her. She was still waiting for Jackson to leave. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked one evening, as they worked side by side reinforcing the cabin's north wall. "What do you want from us?" Jackson considered his answer carefully. "Maybe I know what it's like to be left behind." She studied him, searching for the lie. Finding none, she nodded once and returned to work. Benjamin, 14 and tall for his age, worked alongside them with quiet determination. Now Jackson showed him how to measure cuts, drive nails straight, test joints for strength. The boy had lost both parents in the Silver Creek mine disaster of 1885 and rarely spoke, but his blue eyes missed nothing, and his hands proved deft with tools. "My pa was a carpenter before the mines," he said one day, the longest sentence Jackson had heard from him. "Said a man who can build will never starve." Jackson nodded. Your pa was right. Emma, 12 years old with wire-rimmed spectacles too large for her face, organized the younger children's education. Jackson found her one morning teaching from a tattered McGuffey reader, the only book in the cabin. That afternoon, he rode to the nearest town and returned with slates, chalk, and 3 primers. When he handed them to her, Emma adjusted her glasses and examined each book carefully. "These cost $2 each," she said, fingers tracing the embossed covers. "Knowledge is worth more than dollars," Jackson replied. She looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. "Thank you, Mr. Thornton." Twin brothers, Matthew and Mark, 10 and 8, were inseparable shadows. Orphaned during a diphtheria outbreak in 1884, They'd survived by clinging to each other. Now they followed Jackson everywhere, learning to split kindling, feed livestock, and repair tools. Our ma and pa had a farm, Matthew told Jackson as they worked. Had chickens and a milk cow. And a dog named Captain, Mark added. He was spotted like your horse. Jackson listened to their stories, the memories they kept alive through retelling. He found himself sharing small pieces of his own childhood, the farm in Pennsylvania, the apple orchard, the creek where he'd caught his first fish. 7-year-old Lucy rarely spoke above a whisper. She carried a rag doll missing one button eye, her only possession from before her parents were killed when their wagon train was attacked. For the first week, she hid whenever Jackson entered a room. By the third week, she'd begun leaving small treasures for him to find: a pine cone, a smooth stone, a perfect autumn leaf. Joshua, 5 years old, followed Benjamin constantly, mimicking the older boy's movements. His parents had died of influenza the previous winter, and he had his father's talent for drawing, creating pictures on every available surface using charcoal from the fireplace. Jackson brought him paper and pencils, and soon the cabin walls displayed drawings of horses, mountains, and increasingly, drawings of Jackson himself. And then there was Samuel, barely 3 years old with blonde curls and enormous brown eyes. His parents had died of smallpox when he was just a year old. Unlike the others, he had never known his parents, never formed memories to mourn. Perhaps that explained his fearlessness around Jackson. Within days, Samuel had begun following Jackson like a shadow. When Jackson sat to rest, the boy climbed into his lap without asking permission. Jackson froze. 30 years since anyone had touched him with simple affection. 30 years of careful distance shattered by a child's trust. He awkwardly patted Samuel's blonde curls. The boy settled against his chest and fell asleep. Elizabeth, now recovered from her fever, smiled from the doorway. He knows good people. Jackson had brought lumber enough to double the cabin size. Working in the bitter cold of early winter, he showed Henry and Benjamin how to construct proper notched corners, draft-proof windows, and a secondary chimney that would draw the smoke properly while conserving heat. This joinery method comes from Sweden, he explained as they worked. Wood expands and contracts with moisture and temperature. This joint allows for that movement without compromising structural integrity. "Where'd you learn all this?" Henry asked, impressed by Jackson's knowledge. "My father. He built our farm with his own hands." Jackson hadn't spoken of his father in decades. The words felt strange on his tongue, like a language half forgotten. As the cabin grew, so did the sense of something Jackson had never expected to find here: family. Each evening they gathered around the expanded hearth where Elizabeth cooked meals made substantial by Jackson's supplies. 14 people squeezed together at the table, elbows touching, warmth shared. One night, as the younger children prepared for bed, Jackson found a scrap of wood and his pocket knife. His hands remembered skills his father had taught him 40 years ago. By dawn, he'd carved a small horse, rough but recognizable, smooth enough not to hurt small hands. Samuel found it beside his pallet when he woke. His eyes went wide. "Mine?" Jackson's throat felt tight. "Yeah, boy, yours." "You stay?" The question hung in the air. Every child in the room had stopped moving, waiting for his answer. Jackson met Sarah's eyes across the cabin. She'd asked him the same question without words every day for 3 weeks. "For now," he said. It wasn't enough, but it was honest. The next morning, all 11 children lined up outside waiting to help with construction. Benjamin handed Jackson a nail without being asked. Sarah nodded approval. They had decided to trust him. Now he had to decide if he could trust himself not to fail them. Early December and the cabin had grown. New walls enclosed a second room. The roof no longer leaked. The hearth Elizabeth cooked at was twice its original size. The structure that had barely held 2 now sheltered 14. Evening fell soft as prayer. Snow drifted past the windows. Inside, lamplight glowed warm. The children gathered around the fire, some mending clothes, some practicing letters on slates Jackson had bought. The youngest one simply leaning against Elizabeth's knees. For the first time in 2 years, Henry and Elizabeth looked like they might sleep without fear. After the children went to bed, Elizabeth poured coffee for the 3 adults. Her hands no longer shook. "Mr. Thornton," she said quietly, "there's things you should know." Jackson waited. "We're not legal guardians. We have no rights to these children. 2 years ago, the county tried to take them, separate them to different institutions. We fled in the night with what we could carry." She paused, gathering strength. It was September of '85. A wagon pulled up at the orphanage in town. Sarah was there with her brothers and sisters after the tuberculosis took their parents. The county officer had papers to send the girls to the state home in Denver and the boys to a farm in Boulder. Henry took up the thread. Sarah ran away that night with her siblings, found their way to our door. We'd lost our own children years ago to diphtheria. Elizabeth took one look at those hungry faces and took them in. Word spread. More children came. Elizabeth's voice steadied. Those institutions, they break children. We've seen it. We'd rather hide than hand them over. When Samuel came to us, he was barely a year old, she continued. Only survivor when smallpox took a homesteader family over in Elk Valley. County officers said he'd be adopted quick, being so young. But we'd heard stories about those adoption arrangements. Children sold as servants, or worse. Henry added, we're squatters on what was free land. Now it's your land, and we're criminals in the county's eyes. Jackson had suspected as much. What happens if they find you? They take the children, send them separately, won't keep siblings together, and we'd likely face charges for kidnapping, even though we saved them from starvation. The fire crackled. Outside, wind whispered through pine trees. I'll look into it, Jackson said. There has to be a legal way. But even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at him. He'd built his fortune in part by knowing how law worked and, while rarely sided with the poor against institutions. The next morning, a telegram arrived from town. Jackson read it twice, face hardening. Have arranged sale of timber rights to Colorado Central Mining, stop. $30,000, stop. Finalizing paperwork next week, stop. All squatters must vacate immediately, stop. Victor Hayes. Jackson stared at the paper. His empire or this family, his reputation, or these children. He couldn't have both. That evening, the children sang their nightly hymn, a tradition Elizabeth maintained. Come thou fount of every blessing. Their voices, thin but pure, filled the cabin with something Jackson couldn't name. He hadn't prayed since he was 12, hadn't set foot in a church since his parents' funeral. But sitting there, surrounded by orphans singing about grace, something cracked inside his chest. Sarah met his eyes across the fire. She was too young to look so old, too scarred to trust easily. You don't have to stay, she said quietly. Words meant for him alone. But if you do, stay for real. We've had enough of people who leave. The hymn ended. The children filed off to bed. Jackson sat by the fire long after everyone slept, staring at the telegram in his hands. Stay or go, build or abandon, become his uncle or become someone better. The choice was his, and it terrified him. Mid-December brought the county wagon. The children saw at first 2 uniformed men and a woman with a clipboard. Sarah grabbed the youngest ones and pulled them inside, face pale. She'd seen wagons like this before. Sheriff Coleman dismounted, official papers in hand. He was a decent man doing an indecent job, and the regret showed in his eyes. Henry Harrison, Elizabeth Harrison. You're ordered to vacate this property within 72 hours. The children will be remanded to county custody for proper placement. Henry stood between the sheriff and the cabin door. We've done nothing wrong. You're harboring orphans without legal authority. Someone filed a complaint on sanitary conditions. Child endangerment. The sheriff's voice softened. I'm sorry, Henry, but the law is the law. Jackson stepped forward. Who filed the complaint? A second wagon arrived. Victor Hayes climbed down, expensive suit out of place in the rough valley. His smile was sharp as broken glass. I did, Victor said pleasantly. Jackson, you have wasted a month on this charity project. I'm finalizing the land sale. These squatters are your problem if you choose to make them so. He paused, letting the threats sink in. But choose that and you're out. Our investors won't tolerate a partner who's financially reckless. Jackson's hands clenched. You had no right. I had every right. You're jeopardizing a fortune over, Victor gestured dismissively at the cabin. Sentiment, sign the papers, walk away, be smart for once. Victor lowered his voice, speaking for Jackson alone. I've seen the signs. You're becoming attached. It's a weakness I never expected from you. His eyes flickered to the scar on Jackson's face. I thought Gettysburg taught you better. Inside the cabin, children pressed against the windows. Samuel held his wooden horse, eyes huge with fear. Henry turned to Jackson, face lined with defeat. Mr. Thornton, you've done more than Christian duty required. This burden isn't yours. We'll find a way. His voice broke on the lie. There was no way. Elizabeth emerged from the cabin, children trailing behind her like ducklings. She taught them to pack their few belongings years ago, to move quickly when adults came with papers. They did it now in eerie, practiced silence. No tears, no pleas. They'd learned that tears changed nothing. Sarah helped the younger ones fold their clothes. Benjamin carried the baby. Matthew and Mark stood protectively beside the younger children, jaws tight. Samuel walked to Jackson, wooden horse clutched in small hands. He held it up, offering it back. Jackson couldn't speak, couldn't move. "Give me until morning," he finally said to Victor. "I'll have an answer then." Victor smiled. Wise choice. Jackson mounted Diablo. From the cabin doorway, Samuel watched him go. Elizabeth turned away, shoulders shaking. The children had learned this truth. Adults leave. They always do, even the kind ones. Only Sarah kept watching until Jackson disappeared over the ridge. Her face was unreadable, but her hands were clenched, white-knuckled at her sides. She'd warned him, "Don't stay unless you mean it." And now he was proving her right. The hotel room in town mocked Jackson with its luxury, velvet chairs, imported whiskey, a bed softer than any orphan had ever touched. He sat in darkness, unsigned papers on the desk, seeing Samuel's face in every shadow. The numbers were clear. Sign and he kept everything. Fortune, reputation, comfortable isolation. Refuse and he lost it all in a legal battle he couldn't win. He'd spent 30 years building this empire. Everything he'd worked for, sacrificed for, protected at the cost of connection. Jackson stood, stared at his reflection in the mirror. Expensive suit, graying temples, cold eyes. He looked exactly like Uncle Richard. The realization hit like a fist to the chest. He'd become the man who'd made his own childhood a prison. Wealthy, powerful, emotionally dead. He'd chosen safety over love for 3 decades and called it strength. The orphans' faces haunted him. Samuel's trust, Sarah's warning. The practiced silence of children who'd learned not to hope. Outside, snow began to fall, covering the town in a clean white blanket. Tomorrow would bring decisions that couldn't be undone. Choices that would define not just Jackson's future, but the future of 11 children who'd already lost too much. He turned from the mirror, unable to face himself any longer. The wooden horse sat on the desk where he'd placed it, a simple carving that somehow contained everything he'd spent his life avoiding. Jackson Thornton, the millionaire lumber baron, the survivor of Gettysburg, the orphan who'd built an empire, sat alone in the darkness, facing the hardest battle of his life. The battle against his own fear. Dawn crept cold and reluctant over the town of Pine Creek. Jackson watched from the hotel window as merchants swept snow from boardwalks and stoked fires in iron stoves. Normal life untouched by the decision that had kept him awake through the night. He fingered the wooden horse in his coat pocket, a simple carving that now carried the weight of 11 futures. The glass panes reflected his haggard appearance, a man caught between worlds. The velvet curtains, brass fixtures, and feather mattress of the Mountain View Hotel stood in stark contrast to the sparse cabin he had left behind. He had not slept. How could he, when the faces of the children haunted him? Especially Samuel, offering back the wooden horse, believing as all the others did that adults always leave. Jackson placed the carving on the polished desk beside Victor's contract. 2 pieces of wood, 2 paths forward. One would preserve his fortune, his standing, his carefully constructed life. The other represented something he couldn't name, something he had spent 30 years avoiding. "Not my problem," he whispered, repeating the mantra that had carried him through decades of shrewd business dealings. But the words rang hollow now, like counterfeit coins. The Denver law office of Judge Thaddeus Montgomery occupied the 2nd floor of the granite courthouse, its windows overlooking the snow-covered plaza. At 72, Montgomery remained one of the most formidable legal minds in Colorado territory. His white beard and stooped shoulders belied the sharp intelligence in his eyes. "Jackson Thornton," he said, rising from behind his desk. "I knew your father." Jackson removed his hat. "I didn't know that. William Thornton helped me build my first cabin when I came west in '55. Montgomery gestured to a chair. He was a good man, believed in doing right, not just doing well. The implied comparison hung in the air between them. Jackson sat, placing Victor's contract on the desk. "I need to know if there's a legal way to protect a group of orphans without surrendering them to county institutions." Montgomery's bushy eyebrows rose. Unusual question from a timber baron, unusual circumstances. For the next hour, Jackson explained the situation at the cabin, the children's backgrounds, the Harrisons' makeshift guardianship, and Victor's ultimatum. Montgomery listened without interruption, fingers steepled beneath his chin. When Jackson finished, the old lawyer leaned back in his chair. "The county has legal precedent on their side. Since the orphan train movement began in the '50s, The state has claimed authority over parentless children. What exactly is this orphan train? Jackson asked. A program started by Charles Loring Brace in 1854, Montgomery explained. Thousands of orphaned and homeless children from eastern cities shipped west on trains to be placed with farm families. Some find good homes, others, he shook his head, essentially indentured servitude. And the county institutions? Overcrowded, understaffed, children separated by age and gender, siblings rarely see each other. Boys typically sent to labor farms at 12, girls to domestic service, education minimal, discipline harsh. Montgomery's expression darkened. Courts typically favor these institutions over informal arrangements, especially when the informal guardians lack resources. These institutions are no better than labor camps. Montgomery nodded grimly. I don't disagree. I've seen the reports. Children work to exhaustion, minimal education, cases of abuse ignored or hidden. He studied Jackson's face. What exactly are you proposing to do? Whatever's necessary. Even if it costs you everything? Jackson met the older man's gaze without flinching. Even then. Montgomery stroked his beard, considering. There might be a way. The Charitable Trust Act of 1879 allows for the establishment of private orphanages with licensed directors. With sufficient funding and proper facilities, such an institution could legally house these children without separating them. What would it require? Substantial financial commitment, proper facilities, licensed supervision, and your partner would need to be neutralized legally. Jackson leaned forward. Explain. Montgomery pulled a blank sheet of paper from a drawer. First, we establish an irrevocable trust, the land and sufficient funding to maintain the orphanage permanently, beyond the reach of creditors or business partners. Second, we license the Harrisons as directors under your supervision. Third, his eyes narrowed, we find leverage against your partner to prevent interference. What kind of leverage? That depends on what Mr. Hayes might be hiding. Jackson thought of Victor's meticulous record-keeping, his insistence on controlling the company books personally. I have suspicions about the company finances. Then I suggest we begin there. Montgomery dispatched clerks to the county records office in the territorial court. By noon, they had acquired the complete financial records of Thornton Timber Company for the past 5 years, along with records of Victor's personal banking transactions. Jackson examined the ledgers with the methodical precision that had made him wealthy. Hours passed as he cross-referenced entries, tracked patterns, and identified discrepancies. His suspicions crystallized into certainty. Here, he said finally, indicating a column of figures, equipment purchases from Rocky Mountain Supply Company, $20,000 over 18 months. Montgomery peered at the entries. Seems legitimate. It would be, except Rocky Mountain Supply doesn't exist. I've never heard of them, and I know every supplier in the territory. Jackson flipped through several more pages. And here, consulting fees to a JW Enterprises, another $20,000. No contracts, no work products, nothing to show for it. They dug deeper. By evening, they had uncovered a complex scheme of false companies, fabricated invoices, and redirected funds, all leading to private accounts controlled by Victor Hayes. $60,000, Jackson said grimly, over 3 years. Montgomery whistled softly, a substantial sum. As night fell, a county clerk delivered the final piece of the puzzle. Records of payments from Victor Hayes to County Inspector Thomas Clark, dated 1 week before the complaint against the Harrison cabin was filed. $200, Montgomery noted. Quite a coincidence. Not a coincidence, Jackson replied. Bribery. They worked through the night, Montgomery drafting legal documents, while Jackson calculated the financial requirements for a perpetual trust. By dawn, Montgomery placed a stack of papers before Jackson. The Thornton Harrison Orphanage Trust, fully funded, legally sound, with you and the Harrisons as trustees. The land and buildings are now held in perpetual trust for the care of orphaned children. Jackson looked at the papers. What's the cost? Montgomery met his eyes. Everything. Your timber company shares, your Denver properties, most of your liquid assets. You'll retain your personal ranch and enough to live modestly, but your fortune will be gone. Jackson signed without hesitation. There's one more matter, Montgomery said, sliding a final document across the desk. Evidence of Victor Hayes' embezzlement and bribery, ready to file with the federal prosecutor. Use it only if necessary. Jackson folded the paper and placed it inside his coat. Thank you. The old lawyer nodded once. Your father would be proud. Dawn broke clear and cold over the Pine Ridge Valley as Jackson rode toward the cabin. The fresh snow sparkled in the early light, unmarked except for the tracks of his horse. From the ridge, he could see smoke rising from the cabin chimney. They hadn't left yet. As he descended into the valley, Jackson saw the county wagon still there, horses stamping in the cold. Victor's carriage waited beside it, its black lacquered surface gleaming against the snow. Jackson rode slowly, deliberately, giving himself time to consider what came next. The scene at the cabin was one of resigned preparation. The children stood in a line outside, small bundles at their feet. Henry and Elizabeth flanked them, faces drawn with exhaustion and defeat. Sheriff Coleman waited beside his wagon, uncomfortable but resolute. Victor paced impatiently, checking his gold pocket watch. About time, Victor said as Jackson dismounted. The papers are ready. Sign them and we can all get out of this godforsaken wilderness. Jackson ignored him, walking instead to Samuel, who stood clutching his wooden horse, eyes wide with hope and fear. Jackson knelt before the boy. I promised I'd come back. Samuel nodded solemnly. You came back, and I'm staying. Jackson rose to face Victor and the sheriff. There's been a change of plans. Victor's smile faded. What are you talking about? Jackson handed Sheriff Coleman a thick envelope. These are legal documents establishing the Thornton Harrison orphanage on this land. The property and sufficient funds have been placed in an irrevocable trust for the care of orphan children, with Henry and Elizabeth Harrison as licensed directors. The sheriff opened the envelope, examining the papers with growing surprise. These appear to be in order. Judge Montgomery's signature and seal. Impossible, Victor hissed, snatching the documents. This land was sold to Colorado Central Mining. The contract was never signed, Jackson finished. The deed is now held in trust. The sale cannot proceed. Victor's face darkened. You've lost your mind. You're throwing away a fortune, your reputation, everything we've built. For what? A pack of orphans? For what matters? Victor stepped closer, voice low with menace. Our investors will destroy you. I'll destroy you. You're nothing without the company. I was nothing with it, Jackson replied evenly. I just didn't know it. Victor's face contorted with rage. You sanctimonious fool. Do you know what I had to do to build this partnership? The connections I cultivated? The bribes I paid? I know exactly what you did, Jackson said. Every penny of the $60,000 you embezzled from the company. Every bribe to county officials, including Inspector Clark, to target this family. Victor paled, then sneered. Prove it. Jackson reached into his coat and withdrew the second envelope. These documents detail your embezzlement of $60,000 from company accounts over the past 3 years. They also contain evidence of your bribery of county officials. You think anyone will believe you, a man who threw away his fortune for a group of brats? The federal prosecutor will. He has copies. Victor lunged suddenly, grabbing for Jackson's coat. You sanctimonious bastard! The children cried out in alarm. Henry moved to intervene, but Jackson stood his ground, not raising a hand against his former partner. Victor's fingers closed around Jackson's lapels, his face inches away. You know nothing about what it takes to survive in this world, Victor snarled. I was 7 when my parents died. 7. I grew up in a state orphanage much like the one waiting for these children. No one came for me. No one established a trust fund. I clawed my way out of that hell through sheer will. Something shifted in Jackson's understanding. Is that why you targeted this place? Because they have what you didn't? Victor released him abruptly, as if burned. For a moment, raw pain flashed across his face before the mask of contempt returned. He stepped back, straightening his coat. Walk away now, Jackson said quietly. Drop all claims against this property and these people, or face prison. Victor's hand twitched toward the pistol at his hip. Sheriff Coleman's hand moved to his own weapon. A moment of terrible tension stretched between them. Finally, Victor crumpled the orphanage papers and threw them into the snow. You're finished in Denver. No one will do business with you again. I can live with that. Victor stormed to his carriage, climbed in, and slapped the reins hard against the horses. The vehicle lurched away, spraying snow as it disappeared around the bend. Sheriff Coleman picked up the discarded papers, brushing off snow. These still stand legally, despite his tantrum. He studied Jackson with new respect. Never thought I'd see Jackson Thornton choose people over profit. Neither did I, Jackson admitted. Coleman cleared his throat awkwardly. For what it's worth, I've never liked how the county handles these cases. Too many children, too few resources. Systems broken. He glanced at the children. What you've done here, it's good. Better than what was waiting for them. Thank you, Sheriff. I'll need to file these with the county clerk. He tipped his hat. Good day to you all. As the county wagon pulled away, the children remained frozen in place, unable to comprehend the sudden reversal of fortune. Samuel was the first to move, running to Jackson and wrapping small arms around his leg. One by one, the others approached, disbelief giving way to cautious hope. Sarah stood apart, watching Jackson with wary eyes. What does this mean? It means you stay together. All of you. This land, this cabin, everything belongs to all of you now. No one can take it away. And you? Her voice carried the weight of too many broken promises. I'm staying too, for as long as you'll have me. Elizabeth pressed a hand to her mouth, tears streaming freely. Henry clasped Jackson's shoulder, too overcome to speak. Around them, the younger children began to laugh and play in the snow, the specter of separation vanishing like morning mist. Only Benjamin remained solemn, studying Jackson's face. You gave up your fortune for us. Jackson met the boy's gaze. Some things are worth more than money. The news spread quickly through the nearby town. By midday, a small crowd had gathered at the edge of the property, curious about the millionaire who had apparently lost his mind. They watched from a distance as Jackson, Henry, and the older boys began unloading supplies from a wagon. Heard Thornton's gone soft in the head, Silas Weber, the town blacksmith, remarked to the others. Gave up a $30,000 lumber deal for these orphans. Man's entitled to do what he wants with his own money, Tom Fletcher, the general store owner, replied. Though I was counting on that mining company's business. Might be a blessing in disguise, schoolteacher Martha Thompson observed. Mining would have polluted the creek we all depend on. Reverend Miller and his wife approached the cabin first, carrying a basket of bread and preserves. We've come to help, he said simply. Jackson looked up from the lumber he was stacking. Why? Because it's the Christian thing to do, Mrs. Miller replied, and because every child deserves a chance. The Reverend surveyed the expanded cabin with its new addition. You'll need more space with this many children. The church has lumber left from our last expansion. It's yours if you can use it. More townspeople followed their example. Dr. Wilson arrived with his medical bag to check Elizabeth and the children. I'll come once a month, he offered. No charge. Martha Thompson studied the children with a teacher's eye. These children need education. I can come 3 times weekly after regular school hours. By sunset, attitudes had begun to shift. The initial curiosity and skepticism giving way to something like respect. As the visitors departed, promises of further help were exchanged. Seeds of community planted in previously barren ground. That evening, as the children ate a proper meal at the expanded table, Jackson found himself the subject of curious glances and whispered conversations. Is it true, Emma finally asked, adjusting her 2 large spectacles, that you were one of the richest men in Denver? Jackson considered his answer carefully. I had a great deal of money, yes. And you gave it up? Matthew asked incredulously. Most of it. Why? This from Sarah, her green eyes intense. Jackson looked around the table at the faces turned toward him, faces that had known too much loss, too much uncertainty. Because family matters more than fortune. The words surprised him as much as them. But they were true, he realized. For the first time in 30 years, he was part of something that mattered more than ledgers and bank accounts. 2 weeks later, the town council convened a special meeting to discuss the orphanage. Jackson attended, sitting quietly at the back of the schoolhouse where meetings were held. 23 townspeople had gathered, an unusually large turnout. Mayor Perkins called the meeting to order. As you all know, the Harrison Thornton Orphanage has been established in our community. There are questions about how this will affect our town. Several merchants expressed concerns about lost business from the abandoned mining project. Others worried about the burden additional children might place on town resources. These children will need schooling, one man pointed out. Our school is already crowded. And who's to say more won't come, another added. We could be overrun with orphans. Reverend Miller rose to speak. I visited the orphanage. What I saw there was nothing short of miraculous. Children who would have been separated, worked like animals, denied education, instead receiving care, schooling, and most importantly, love. Martha Thompson stood next. I've begun teaching these children. They're bright, eager to learn. They've already experienced more hardship than most of us will know in a lifetime. Do we turn our backs on them now? Dr. Wilson added his support. The facility is clean, well organized. The children are healthier now than when I first examined them. What Mr. Thornton has established is a model institution. The mood in the room shifted gradually. When Jackson finally rose to speak, the crowd fell silent. I understand your concerns, he began. I was a businessman long before I became... He hesitated, searching for the right word. Whatever I am now, I know the value of profit and progress. He surveyed the faces before him, people who had only known him as a wealthy stranger passing through. But I've learned that true value isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in lives changed, in futures preserved. These children would have been scattered to the winds, their potential wasted. Now they have a chance, not just to survive, but to thrive. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I'm not asking for charity. The trust I've established will provide for their basic needs. But I am asking for your acceptance, your community, your wisdom. These children need more than food and shelter. They need neighbors, mentors, friends. A long silence followed. Then Mayor Perkins stood. I think I speak for many here when I say you and those children are welcome in Pine Creek. As spring arrived, the transformation of the orphanage continued. The original cabin now formed the central portion of a much larger structure. Two wings extended from the main building, one serving as boys' dormitory, the other as girls' quarters. A separate classroom had been constructed, bright with windows and properly furnished with desks, slates, and books. Jackson stood over a makeshift drafting table, examining plans for a barn. Benjamin beside him. Swedish joining technique, Jackson explained, pointing to the diagram. No nails needed. The weight of the roof actually strengthens the joint as it settles. Benjamin studied the drawing intently. How did you learn all this? My father. He built our farm in Pennsylvania with these methods. The boy nodded, absorbing the information like the dry earth took spring rain. My father was a carpenter before the mines. Said a man who can build will never starve. Your father was right. They worked side by side, sawing lumber to precise measurements. Jackson found unexpected satisfaction in teaching the boy, watching skill develop beneath his guidance. Something his own uncle had never provided, patient instruction rather than cold expectation. In the classroom, Emma flourished under Martha Thompson's tutelage. The girl had a natural aptitude for mathematics that astonished both teacher and benefactor. Jackson ordered advanced texts from Denver, materials typically reserved for male students preparing for university. I want to be a doctor, she confided one evening as they reviewed her studies. Is that foolish? No, he said firmly. Difficult, perhaps, but not foolish. If anyone can do it, you can. The twins, Matthew and Mark, appointed themselves Jackson's shadows, following him everywhere, asking endless questions about his time as a soldier, his travels, his knowledge of animals and machines. Were you scared? In the war? Matthew asked one day as they repaired a fence. Jackson considered the question with the honesty it deserved. Every day, any man who says otherwise is either lying or a fool. Then why did you fight? Mark wanted to know. Because sometimes we must do what frightens us to protect what matters. The boys exchanged glances, absorbing this truth into their developing understanding of manhood. Sarah remained the most cautious, watching Jackson with the wariness of one who had learned betrayal too young. But as weeks passed without him showing any sign of leaving, her sharp edges gradually softened. She became his fiercest ally in managing the younger children, anticipating needs before they arose, creating systems that transformed chaos into order. One evening, Jackson found her alone by the fire, mending a shirt with precise stitches. You're good at that, he observed. Had to be. No one else was going to clothe my brothers and sisters after Mom died. The bitterness in her voice was an old companion. Jackson sat across from her. You've carried too much for too long. She looked up, green eyes reflecting firelight. Someone had to. Yes, but now you don't have to carry it alone. Sarah's hand stilled on the mending. For a moment, the guard she maintained so carefully slipped, revealing the exhausted child beneath the caretaker. I don't know how to stop, she whispered. You learn, day by day. Jackson hesitated, then added, I'm still learning too. The flash of understanding between them formed a bridge neither had expected to cross. Samuel, always Samuel, remained Jackson's most devoted companion. The toddler slept with his wooden horse every night, carried it with him during the day, and insisted on helping with every task Jackson undertook. His uninhibited affection broke down barriers Jackson hadn't known still existed. One night in late February, Jackson was awakened by Samuel's crying. The boy had developed a fever, his small body burning hot beneath the quilts. Jackson carried him to the main cabin, where Elizabeth prepared willow bark tea and cool compresses. "Will he be all right?" Jackson asked, his voice tight with fear he couldn't hide. "Children get fevers," Elizabeth assured him. "We'll watch him through the night." Jackson refused to leave Samuel's side, holding the boy as he tossed restlessly, spooning broth and medicine between cracked lips, bathing his flushed face with cool water. By dawn, Jackson's shirt was soaked with sweat, his own and Samuel's. But the fever had broken. The boy slept peacefully in his arms. Henry found them there as morning light filtered through the windows. "You should rest," he said quietly. "I can take him now." Jackson shook his head. "I'm fine where I am." Henry studied him with knowing eyes. "It's a frightening thing, isn't it? Caring this much." Jackson looked down at Samuel's sleeping face. "Terrifying." "Worth it, though." "Yes," Jackson agreed. "Worth everything." As March arrived with the hints of thaw, the orphanage received its first visitors from the county office, not to remove the children, but to inspect the new establishment. The transformation since December impressed even the most skeptical officials. Clean, well-organized sleeping quarters. A proper classroom with books and learning materials. A large kitchen with adequate food supplies. Healthy, clean, and most surprisingly happy children. The lead inspector, Mrs. Whitmore, made notes as she toured the facilities. "I must admit, Mr. Thornton, when I heard a lumber baron had established an orphanage, I was skeptical of your motives." "And now?" Jackson asked. She gestured to Lucy and Joshua, who were showing her their new books. "Now I wonder if other wealthy men might follow your example. There are so many children in need." The inspection report brought unexpected consequences. Within weeks, requests began arriving from county offices across the territory. Could the Thornton Harry Bite Orphanage accommodate more children? A 6-year-old girl whose parents had died of pneumonia in Boulder. Twin boys, aged 4, orphaned when their father was killed in a mining accident in Central City. A 10-year-old from Denver whose mother could no longer care for him. Jackson gathered the family around the dinner table to discuss each request. "This is your home too," he told the children. "You should have a say in who joins us." Sarah spoke first. "We have room now, and we know what it's like to have nowhere to go." Benjamin nodded. "We can build more beds." One by one, each child agreed. Even Samuel, understanding only that new children might come, declared, "More friends." By April, the Thornton Harry Shore Orphanage had grown to 17 children. The expansion required more help than the Harrisons and Jackson could provide alone. They hired Mrs. Collins, a widow from town, to assist with cooking and laundry. Jackson's old foreman, Mr. Peterson, joined to help with construction and maintenance. The community that had begun with suspicious observation now participated with growing investment. Spring transformed the valley. Snow melted into rushing streams. The meadows erupted in wildflowers. Jackson and the older boys planted a vegetable garden 3 times the size of the previous years, adding fruit trees along the southern slope. They constructed a proper barn for the milk cow and horses donated by neighboring ranchers. Life flourished where desperation had once reigned. Jackson rose before dawn each morning, his body accustomed now to physical labor instead of ledgers and contracts. He found satisfaction in tangible accomplishments, a straight furrow in the garden, a properly joined corner in a new outbuilding, the increasing strength in Benjamin's hammer swing. Each day brought challenges that couldn't be solved with money or power, only with persistence and ingenuity. His hair grew longer, his hands calloused, his clothes simpler. The expensive suits remained packed away, unnecessary in this new life. Occasionally letters arrived from Denver, business associates expressing confusion or condemnation over his choices. Jackson read them with detached amusement before using them to start the morning fire. The opinions of Denver society no longer carried weight. Judge Montgomery visited in early May, riding up on a dappled mare with saddlebags full of legal documents and news from the city. "Victor Hayes has left Colorado," he reported as they walked the property. "Headed east after the company collapsed. Too many questions about the missing funds." "Any legal repercussions?" Montgomery shook his head. "Not without your testimony, and I assumed you preferred to leave it be." Jackson nodded, watching Samuel and the newest arrivals playing in the meadow. "That chapter's closed." The judge surveyed the expanded orphanage with approval. "You've created something remarkable here, Jackson. I've spoken with the territorial governor about using your model elsewhere. There's interest in establishing similar facilities in other counties." It wasn't just me. The Harrisons had already begun when I arrived, And the children themselves, Jackson paused, searching for words. They're rebuilding me as much as I'm helping rebuild their lives. Montgomery smiled. Your father used to say that the measure of a house isn't in its size or cost, but in whether it becomes a home. I think he'd approve of what you've built. That evening, after Montgomery departed, Jackson sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and shadow. Sarah joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. The judge seemed impressed, she said, handing him a steaming cup. He's an old friend of my father's, apparently. One of many things I never knew. Sarah settled beside him on the bench. At 15, she had begun the transition from girl to young woman, her features softening even as her spirit remained fierce. Do you miss it, your old life? Jackson considered the question honestly. I miss certain conveniences. Hot baths without hauling water, meals prepared without planning. But the life itself, he shook his head. It was empty in ways I didn't recognize until I left it. Benjamin says you were one of the richest men in Denver. In money, perhaps. Sarah sipped her coffee, watching the younger children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. We're studying banking in school. Compound interest. The value of money over time. She glanced at him. You gave up millions in future earnings for us. Jackson smiled slightly. Are you asking if I regret it? Maybe. I don't. He gestured toward the playing children. Some investments yield different kinds of returns. Sarah was quiet for the long moment. Then so softly he almost missed it. Thank you for staying. Before Jackson could respond, Samuel ran up the porch steps, fireflies temporarily forgotten. Pa Jackson, story time! The simple title, Pa Jackson, had emerged naturally months ago, and now all the younger children used it. Jackson had never corrected them, though sometimes the words still caught him by surprise, a reminder of a role he'd never expected to fill. One story, Jackson agreed, lifting the boy onto his lap. Then bed. As Samuel settled against his chest, Jackson caught Sarah's expression, a mixture of lingering wariness and growing trust. They still had far to go, this makeshift family created from loss and chance and choice. But the foundation was strong, built on something more enduring than fortune or ambition. Inside the cabin, the evening routine unfolded. Elizabeth served warm milk with honey. Henry read from the Bible. The younger children prepared for bed while the older ones completed final chores. Order and safety where once there had been only uncertainty. Later, as Jackson tucked Samuel into bed, the boy clutched his wooden horse and asked the question he still posed every night. Stay forever? And Jackson gave the answer that had evolved from for now to something much more binding. Forever, Samuel. This is home. That night, Jackson stood outside long after the cabin lights dimmed, contemplating the stars scattered across the Colorado sky. 30 years ago, he had lost everything that mattered. He had spent decades building a fortress of wealth to replace what fire had taken, only to discover he had been constructing the wrong kind of shelter all along. Now surrounded by children who had suffered similar losses, he was learning what his father had known instinctively, that true wealth existed in connection, in purpose, in being needed and known. The orphans had saved him as surely as he had helped save them. A soft footfall on the porch announced Henry's presence. The older man joined Jackson in stargazing, comfortable silence between them. There's a family in Willow Creek, Henry said finally. Lost their farm in the drought last summer. 5 children, parents at the end of their rope. Jackson nodded, understanding the unspoken question. How much land do they need? Couple of acres would do. Good water on the north section. We'll ride out tomorrow, make them an offer. Henry nodded, satisfied. Thought you might say that. They stood together a while longer. 2 men who had found unexpected purpose in their final chapters. Below them, the expanded orphanage stood solid against the night, windows dark but for a single lamp in the main room, the one they always left burning for children who woke frightened in the darkness. Never thought I'd be starting a community at my age, Henry mused. Never thought I'd be raising children at mine, Jackson countered. Henry chuckled softly. Life has strange turns. Yes, Jackson agreed, thinking of the long road that had brought him to this place, this moment, this unexpected family. Strange and wonderful turns. In the distance, an owl called, its voice echoing across the valley that was no longer simply property to be bought and sold, but home in the deepest sense. Jackson Thornton, once defined by what he owned, now measured himself by what he gave, and found, to his continuing surprise, that he had never been richer. The summer of 1888 unfurled across the Pine Ridge Valley like a tapestry of green and gold. 6 months had transformed both the land and its inhabitants. What had begun as a desperate stand against separation had blossomed into something none could have predicted. A thriving community centered around the orphanage that now housed 23 children. On a July morning bright with promise, Jackson stood at the edge of the newly expanded veranda, surveying the domain that had become his life's second chapter. The original cabin remained at the center, now dwarfed by additions that stretched in three directions. The east wing housed the boys' dormitory, the west wing the girls'. The southern addition contained a proper dining hall and kitchen large enough to feed 30. A separate schoolhouse stood nearby, its windows gleaming in the morning light. Children's laughter drifted from the creek where the older boys were teaching the younger ones to fish. In the garden, Sarah and Emma worked alongside Elizabeth, harvesting the first summer vegetables. Henry directed a small crew of local men constructing a new barn to replace the hastily built shelter they'd erected in spring. "Hard to believe it was just a cabin 6 months ago," a familiar voice remarked. Jackson turned to find Judge Montgomery dismounting from his mare. The elderly jurist visited monthly now, bringing legal papers, news from Denver, and an appreciation for what he called the Thornton miracle. "Progress has been swift," Jackson acknowledged, extending his hand in greeting. "Not just in buildings." Montgomery gestured toward the children. "I've never seen such transformation in young lives." Jackson nodded. The physical structures were merely the outward manifestation of deeper changes. Benjamin, once silent and wary, now supervised younger boys in woodworking projects, his confidence growing with his skill. Sarah had developed into Elizabeth's trusted lieutenant in managing household affairs, her sharp edges softened by responsibility, freely chosen rather than thrust upon her. Emma's intellectual hunger had earned her a special arrangement with the town physician, who allowed her to observe treatments and study his medical texts. "The territorial governor is visiting next week," Montgomery said, accepting the cup of coffee Jackson offered. "He's interested in what you've accomplished here." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Should I be concerned?" "Quite the contrary. After reviewing Mrs. Whitmore's reports, he believes your model might be replicated elsewhere. Orphanages run with proper funding and familial structure rather than institutional regimen. We're hardly a model institution." "That's precisely the point." Montgomery settled into a porch chair with the ease of familiarity. "What you've created here isn't an institution at all. It's a home." As they conversed, a wagon appeared on the road leading to the orphanage. Jackson recognized Tom Fletcher, the general store owner, accompanied by his wife and teenage daughter. They brought weekly supplies, no longer just business transactions, but contributions from people who had become friends. "Mr. Thornton," Fletcher called as the wagon approached. "Special delivery for your youngsters." His daughter Emily lifted a cloth-covered basket, revealing fresh-baked cookies still warm from the oven. Within moments, children materialized as if by magic, gathering around the wagon with eager anticipation. Jackson watched Samuel push to the front, wooden horse clutched firmly in one hand. "What do we say?" Jackson prompted gently. "Thank you, Mrs. Fletcher," the children chorused, manners having been a primary focus of Elizabeth's instruction. As cookies were distributed and supplies unloaded, Jackson observed the easy interaction between townspeople and orphans. The invisible barrier that had once separated them had dissolved gradually over the past months, replaced by genuine community. Later that evening, after the younger children were abed, Jackson convened a meeting with the older residents in what had become the orphanage's modest library. Henry and Elizabeth, now in their 70s but energized by purpose, sat near the fireplace. Benjamin, Sarah, and Emma, as the eldest of the children, had earned places at these councils. Judge Montgomery completed the circle, legal papers spread before him on an oak table crafted by Benjamin himself. "The governor's visit presents an opportunity," Montgomery began. "With his approval, we could expand the trust's scope, perhaps establish similar homes in other counties." "We've barely stabilized this one," Henry cautioned. "True," Elizabeth added, "but consider how many children remain in those dreadful institutions." Jackson listened as opinions circulated, struck by how this unlikely assembly had become a functioning family unit, each member contributing unique perspective. When Sarah spoke of setting aside space for mothers in crisis, he heard echoes of her own loss. When Benjamin suggested apprenticeship programs for older boys, he recognized the practical wisdom of a young man who understood the value of marketable skills. "What about the Willow Creek family?" Emma inquired. "Have they decided to accept our offer?" Jackson exchanged glances with Henry. They had ridden to the struggling farm 3 times now, offering land, a new cabin, and inclusion in the orphanage's expanded community. Thomas Elliot is a proud man, Henry replied. Accepting help doesn't come easily to him. Pride makes for cold comfort when children go hungry, Elizabeth observed. Jackson understood the sentiment from both sides. He absently rubbed the scar on his face, a habit that emerged whenever he confronted a painful truth. I'll visit them again tomorrow, he decided, rising and reaching for his hat. Sometimes a man needs to hear the same offer multiple times before he can accept it without shame. He paused at the mantel, straightening a small wooden horse Samuel had left there earlier. And sometimes he needs to see proof that accepting help doesn't mean surrendering dignity. After the meeting concluded, Montgomery lingered to share news from Denver. The city's business community still spoke of Jackson Thornton's madness as a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, Victor Hayes had resurfaced in Chicago, attempting to establish new timber interests with limited success. Your former partner faces significant challenges, Montgomery reported. It seems his reputation preceded him. Several investors have withdrawn support after making inquiries in Colorado. Jackson felt no satisfaction at this news. I hope he finds what he's looking for. Redemption, perhaps, Montgomery suggested. It seems to be the specialty of this valley. Dawn found Jackson riding toward Willow Creek, following now familiar trails through pine forest and mountain meadow. The Elliott farm came into view as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, 80 acres of once promising land ravaged by the previous summer's drought. The cabin, though sturdily built, showed signs of desperation. A patched roof, a broken window covered with oilcloth, a garden struggling to produce enough to feed 7 mouths. Thomas Elliot met him at the property line, rifle cradled casually in his arms. Not a threat, but a statement of continued independence. At 40, Elliot's face was deeply lined, his frame whittled lean by hardship and relentless work. Thornton, he acknowledged with a curt nod. Elliot. Jackson dismounted, leading Diablo by the reins. Thought I'd stop by on my way to town. Both men knew it was a polite fiction. Willow Creek lay in the opposite direction from Pine Creek. Margaret's inside with the little ones, Elliot said after a moment. Coffee's hot if you're of a mind. It was the most welcoming greeting yet. Jackson accepted with a nod, tethering Diablo to a fence post. As they walked toward the cabin, he noted subtle changes since his last visit. The eldest boy, Joseph, had repaired portions of the fence. A new chicken coop stood behind the cabin, small improvements that spoke of a family refusing to surrender to circumstances. Inside, Margaret Elliott greeted Jackson with the guarded courtesy of a woman who had learned to expect disappointment. At 38, her once pretty face showed the strain of constant worry. 5 children ranged from 14-year-old Joseph to 3-year-old Mary, all watching the visitor with wary curiosity. The corn's coming in better this year, Thomas remarked, as they seated themselves at the rough-hewn table. Might actually have enough to see us through winter. Jackson accepted a cup of coffee, chicory, he noted, a cheaper substitute for the real thing, and detected the pride beneath the statement. Glad to hear it. Henry mentioned you'd devised a new irrigation method. For the next hour, they engaged in careful conversation. Weather predictions, crop prospects, news from town, the currency of frontier politeness. Only when the younger children were sent outside to complete chores did Jackson broach the true purpose of his visit. My offer stands, Thomas. 2 acres of prime land with good water rights. Help building a proper cabin. Integration into our community while maintaining your independence. Elliot's jaw tightened. Worked this land for 7 years, Thomas said flatly. His words clipped like a man who saved breath as carefully as he saved pennies. Put everything into it. I understand pride, Thomas. I had it in abundance not long ago. Jackson kept his tone neutral, neither pressuring nor pitying. But I've learned there's no shame in accepting help freely given, especially when children's futures hang in the balance. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she refilled coffee cups. The children need schooling, she said softly. Joseph should be apprenticed soon, learning a proper trade. Thomas looked at his wife, something unspoken passing between them. The weight of reality against the anchor of pride. I'd need to see the land myself, he said finally. Walk it, feel the soil. Of course. And I'd work for my keep. Won't take charity. We need a proper foreman for the expanding property, Jackson replied. Henry's knowledge is invaluable, but at 72, the physical demands are becoming too much. It wasn't charity, it was truth. The orphanage's operations had grown beyond what the original trio could manage alone. Peterson handled construction, Mrs. Collins the kitchen, but no one properly oversaw the agricultural aspects of their increasingly complex enterprise. "I'll ride out tomorrow," Thomas decided. "See this land you're offering." "We'll expect you midday," Jackson said, rising to leave. "Bring the family. Elizabeth's making venison stew." As he rode back toward Pine Ridge, Jackson reflected on the exchange. 6 months ago, he would have considered Thomas Elliot foolish for hesitating over such an offer. Now he recognized the struggle between necessity and identity. Accepting help meant acknowledging vulnerability, a lesson Jackson himself had only recently learned. The following day brought the Elliott family to Pine Ridge. Jackson watched from the veranda as their wagon approached. Thomas at the reins, Margaret beside him, children peering from the back with undisguised curiosity. They had dressed in their Sunday best, pride asserting itself even in apparent defeat. Jackson had prepared carefully for this visit, ensuring every aspect would preserve the Elliots' dignity while demonstrating the opportunities available. Henry waited to show Thomas the proposed land and discuss agricultural matters. Elizabeth had arranged for Margaret to observe the orphanage's operations without making her feel studied in return. The children would be integrated naturally into the day's activities. Most importantly, no one would treat the Elliots as objects of charity. They would be welcomed as potential contributors to a community still defining itself. By evening, when the Elliots' wagon departed back toward Willow Creek, the atmosphere had transformed. Thomas had walked the land, tested the soil, examined the water sources, and engaged in extensive discussions with Henry about crops suitable for the terrain. Margaret had helped prepare dinner in the large kitchen, observing the efficient systems Elizabeth had developed. The Elliott children had played with the orphanage residents, forming tentative friendships. "They'll come," Henry predicted as they watched the wagon disappear down the road. "Give them a week to make peace with the decision." 3 days, Elizabeth countered with the wisdom of a woman who had raised multiple children. Margaret won't let pride overrule necessity much longer. It took exactly 5 days. The Elliott wagon returned on a Sunday afternoon loaded with the family's possessions. Thomas's expression remained stoic, but the set of his shoulders had changed, relief replacing resistance. "We accept your offer," he said simply as Jackson welcomed them, "on condition that I serve as foreman with proper wages, and we build our own cabin with help if offered." "Agreed on all counts," Jackson replied, offering his hand to seal the arrangement. As summer progressed into early autumn, the Pine Ridge community expanded in both physical dimension and purpose. The Elliott's cabin rose on the northern edge of the property, constructed through collective effort. Thomas assumed responsibility for agricultural operations with the precision of a man who understood that proper management meant survival. Margaret, discovering a talent for organization, became Elizabeth's primary assistant in running the increasingly complex household. By September, the community that had begun with a desperate stand against county authorities had evolved into a model that attracted attention throughout the territory. When Governor Richard Lawrence arrived for his long-anticipated visit, he found not a makeshift orphanage, but a thriving settlement built around the care of children who would otherwise have been lost to institutional anonymity. The governor's carriage arrived with appropriate ceremony, flags flying, outriders clearing the path, a small retinue of territorial officials in attendance. Jackson, dressed in his one remaining good suit, the others having been sold to fund the trust, received the official party on the main veranda. "Mr. Thornton," Lawrence greeted him with the practiced warmth of a politician, "your reputation precedes you." "For madness or redemption?" Jackson inquired with subtle humor. The governor laughed appreciatively. "Perhaps both. Denver society still speaks of you in hushed tones, the millionaire who renounced fortune for orphans." Simplified but essentially accurate, Lawrence surveyed the grounds where children engaged in normal activities despite the distinguished visitor. "I expected something more institutional." "That was never our intent," Jackson explained as they began a tour. "These children need family, not regimentation." For the next several hours, Lawrence examined every aspect of the operation. The dormitories with their individual touches that preserved identity, the schoolhouse where education exceeded territorial standards, the kitchens and dining hall that functioned with remarkable efficiency. He spoke with Henry about agricultural techniques, with Elizabeth about household management, with Benjamin about the carpentry shop where older boys learned marketable skills. Most tellingly, he observed the children themselves, not as objects of charity, but as individuals thriving under proper care and genuine affection. He noted how Sarah managed the younger girls with natural authority, how Emma assisted Dr. Wilson in the small infirmary, How Samuel had overcome early trauma to become a confident 4-year-old who approached strangers without fear. As sunset painted the western sky in crimson and gold, Lawrence joined Jackson on the veranda for a final assessment. "I came prepared to be impressed by your methods, Mr. Thornton," the governor admitted. "Instead, I find myself moved by your vision. This isn't merely an orphanage, it's a prototype for how communities might care for their most vulnerable members." Jackson acknowledged the compliment with a nod. Judge Montgomery deserves much of the credit for the legal framework. "And the Harrisons began the work long before I arrived. Nevertheless, your contribution was transformative." Lawrence tapped his fingers thoughtfully against the porch railing. "The territorial legislature has been debating reform of our orphanage system for years without progress. Perhaps seeing a functioning alternative would provide the necessary impetus." "What are you suggesting?" "A territorial grant," Lawrence replied. "Funds to expand your model to other counties with appropriate oversight but maintaining your family-centered approach." Jackson considered the proposition carefully. Expansion would mean helping more children, a worthy goal, but it would also mean bureaucracy, reports, inspections, elements that might undermine the very essence of what made Pine Ridge successful. "I would need assurances of autonomy," he said finally. "Our methods work precisely because we aren't bound by institutional constraints." "Of course," Lawrence agreed readily. "I envision a system of affiliated homes, each adapted to its community, but following your general principles. The territorial grant would provide financial stability without imposing standardization." They discussed details as twilight deepened: funding mechanisms, governance structures, expansion timelines. Lawrence described communities where similar homes might thrive, each anchored by individuals committed to genuine care rather than mere supervision. "We'll need to identify the right people," Jackson noted. "This model works because of who implements it, not just how it's structured." "I have several candidates in mind," Lawrence replied. "Former teachers, clergy members, others with both compassion and practical ability." By evening's end, they had sketched the outline of a program that could potentially transform child welfare across the territory. Lawrence departed with promises to draft formal proposals and return within the month. After the governor's carriage disappeared down the valley road, Jackson found himself alone on the veranda, contemplating the implications of the day's discussions. Expansion meant influence beyond Pine Ridge, the opportunity to spare countless children the fate he had narrowly helped these avoid. Yet something in him resisted the transformation of personal mission into public policy. "You're troubled," Elizabeth observed, joining him with a cup of coffee. "Cautious," he corrected. "The governor's proposal could help many children, but it could also bureaucratize what works precisely because it isn't a government program." Elizabeth considered this. "When I was a girl in Pennsylvania, my mother had a saying, 'If you want the bread to rise, you must share the starter.' Meaning, what we've created here contains something living, something that can grow elsewhere if properly nurtured." She patted his arm with grandmotherly familiarity. "The trick is sharing the essence without losing it ourselves." The wisdom in her words resonated. Perhaps the true challenge wasn't preventing bureaucratization, but ensuring that the essential spirit of Pine Ridge, family structure, individual dignity, genuine care, remained at the core of any expansion. As autumn painted the valley in russet and gold, preparation for winter occupied every resident. The harvest proved abundant, filling newly constructed root cellars and storerooms with provisions for the months ahead. Firewood was stacked in precise cords beside each building. The older boys, under Benjamin's direction, insulated dormitories with additional layers of muslin and paper. Samuel, now firmly attached to Jackson as a surrogate son, followed him everywhere during these preparations, wooden horse invariably in hand. The child's vocabulary had expanded dramatically, allowing him to pepper Jackson with endless questions about every task. "Why coal come?" he asked one morning as they inspected the root cellar. "Because the earth tilts away from the sun in winter," Jackson explained, adjusting his explanation for a 4-year-old's understanding. "The sun's light hits us at an angle instead of directly overhead." Samuel considered this with the seriousness of a philosopher. "Sun not like us no more?" Jackson smiled. "The sun doesn't have feelings, Samuel. It's just very far away, and our planet moves around it in a pattern." "Like dance?" "Exactly like a dance, a very slow, very precise dance that takes a full year to complete." These conversations had become one of Jackson's greatest pleasures. Watching a young mind develop, encouraging curiosity, providing explanations that expanded Samuel's understanding of the world. What had begun as reluctant caretaking had evolved into something Jackson had never expected to experience: fatherhood. He was not alone in this transformation. Throughout the community, adults and children had formed bonds that transcended biological connection. Henry had become Benjamin's mentor in all matters agricultural and mechanical. Elizabeth guided Sarah in household management with the expectation that the girl would eventually assume leadership. Thomas Eliot had taken Joseph under his wing, recognizing in the 14-year-old a natural affinity for animal husbandry. Even the youngest children found their places in this unusual family structure. Lucy, once so silent and frightened, now sang constantly as she helped Margaret with simple household tasks. Joshua covered the walls of his dormitory section with increasingly sophisticated drawings, his talent nurtured by weekly lessons from a traveling artist who had taken interest in the boy's abilities. On a crisp October afternoon, Jackson rode to Pine Creek for supplies and to mail Governor Lawrence's latest correspondence regarding the expansion program. The town had changed subtly since his first arrival nearly a year earlier. The general store had expanded its inventory to accommodate the orphanage's regular orders. A new schoolhouse was under construction, partly funded by a donation from the Thornton Harrison Trust. Most noticeably, the townspeople's attitudes had shifted from initial suspicion to genuine respect. Jackson received greetings from merchants and farmers alike, no longer viewed as an eccentric millionaire, but as a valued community member. As he tied Diablo outside the general store, Jackson noticed an expensive carriage parked nearby, unusual for the modest frontier town. He thought little of it until he emerged from the store to find a well-dressed man examining his horse with knowledgeable interest. "Fine animal," the stranger remarked. "Cavalry stock, if I'm not mistaken." "He is," Jackson confirmed, loading supplies into his saddlebags. The man turned, and recognition dawned simultaneously for both. Victor Hayes stood before him, elegantly attired as always, but somehow diminished from their last encounter. "Jackson Thornton," Victor said, after a moment's silence. "I hardly expected to find you here." "I live here now," Jackson replied simply. "What brings you to Pine Creek, Victor?" An uncomfortable silence stretched between them, history and betrayal hanging unspoken in the autumn air. "Business interests westward," Victor finally answered. "I stopped to rest the horses." Jackson nodded, sensing more beneath the explanation but unwilling to press. "Safe travels, then." He mounted Diablo, prepared to ride away from this unexpected ghost from his past, but Victor's voice halted him. "They say you've built something remarkable at Pine Ridge." Jackson turned, studying his former partner's face. The customary arrogance had faded, replaced by something less certain. "You're welcome to see for yourself," he offered, surprising himself. "We serve dinner at 6. Victor's expression revealed equal surprise. "That's unexpectedly generous, considering our last encounter." "Things change," Jackson said simply. "People too sometimes." With that, he rode toward home, wondering if Victor would accept the impulsive invitation and what his presence might mean for the community that had formed in his absence. By 5:30, Jackson had nearly convinced himself that Victor would not appear. The invitation had been polite formality, nothing more. He was therefore startled when Sarah announced from the veranda, "Carriage coming. Fancy one." Jackson stepped outside to see Victor's carriage approaching along the main road, driver maintaining a respectful pace. He had not mentioned the invitation to anyone, unsure himself why he had extended it. "An old acquaintance from Denver," he explained to Henry and Elizabeth as the carriage drew nearer. "I thought perhaps—" He couldn't properly articulate his reasoning, but Elizabeth nodded as if understanding completely. "I'll set another place." Victor's arrival created a ripple of curiosity throughout the orphanage. Children peered from windows and doorways, intrigued by the elegant visitor. Thomas Eliot, recognizing the man's bearing as similar to Jackson's former life, positioned himself nearby, protective of the community he had joined. "Quite an operation you've developed," Victor observed as Jackson led him on an abbreviated tour before dinner. "Far beyond what I expected when I heard you'd established an orphanage." "It evolved naturally," Jackson replied, noting how Victor observed everything with the keen assessment of a businessman rather than the appreciation of a guest. Dinner proved unexpectedly cordial. Victor displayed impeccable manners, engaging the children in appropriate conversation, complimenting Elizabeth on the meal, discussing agricultural techniques with Henry. If he felt discomfort in this setting so different from his normal social sphere, he concealed it well. Only after the children had been excused and the adults gathered for coffee In the modest library, did Victor reveal his true purpose. "I've come to make amends, Jackson," he stated without preamble. "What I did was inexcusable." The statement hung in the air, its sincerity impossible to gauge. "That's between you and your conscience," Jackson replied carefully. Victor's jaw tightened. "Is that all you have to say? I've traveled 500 miles? For absolution?" Jackson interrupted. "I'm not a priest, Victor." Victor's eyes flashed with familiar anger. "No, you're a saint now, aren't you? The millionaire who sacrificed all the orphans. Tell me, does it feel good to be worshipped by these simple country folk?" Several children passing by the library door, Bo froze at the raised voice. Thomas Elliot stepped forward protectively, but Jackson waved him back. "Why are you really here, Victor?" The anger drained from Victor's face, replaced by something Jackson had never seen there before. Desperation. "Because everything I built is crumbling," Victor admitted, his voice low. "And watching you lose everything, yet somehow gain more, has haunted me for months." He withdrew an envelope from his jacket. "I've liquidated certain assets acquired during our partnership, assets that rightfully belong to you. The proceeds are yours." Jackson made no move to accept the envelope. "The trust is fully funded. We need nothing from you." "It isn't charity," Victor insisted. "It's restitution." The echo of Thomas Elliot's earlier pride was not lost on Jackson. "Why now, Victor? It's been nearly a year." Victor's gaze dropped into his hands, manicured nails a stark contrast to the work-roughened hands of the Pine Ridge residents. "I've had time to reflect. Chicago proved less welcoming than anticipated. Business associates made inquiries in Denver, discovered certain irregularities." "You were caught," Henry translated bluntly. "Not legally." Victor's composure slipped momentarily, but effectively blacklisted in circles where reputation determines opportunity. Jackson studied his former partner, searching for genuine contrition beneath the pragmatic exterior. "So this is rehabilitation of your business standing, not true remorse." "Can it not be both?" Victor challenged. "I've had months to consider my actions, not just against you, but throughout my career. I'm not proud of what reflection revealed." The silence that followed was broken by Elizabeth's quiet observation. "Redemption begins with a single step, however imperfect the motivation." Victor seemed startled by her contribution, having perhaps dismissed the elderly woman as irrelevant to the conversation between men of business. "The money rightfully belongs to these children," he insisted, placing the envelope on the table. "Use it or burn it, as you see fit. Either way, my conscience will be marginally clearer." After Victor's departure, the envelope remained untouched on the library table, a physical manifestation of a complicated moral question. Jackson, Henry, Elizabeth, and Thomas debated long into the night about whether accepting such funds constituted endorsement of Victor's methods or pragmatic use of resources for deserving recipients. "The money was stolen from your company," Thomas argued. "In that sense, it's already yours." "But accepting it implies forgiveness," Henry countered. "Are we prepared to extend that so readily?" Elizabeth, practical as always, focused on outcomes. 23 children need winter clothing. The roof requires additional reinforcement before snow. And Governor Lawrence's expansion program will need matching funds. Jackson listened to all perspectives, weighing principles against practicalities. "What would you have me do?" he asked finally. "Create a separate fund," Elizabeth suggested. "Use it for expansion rather than current operations. That way it benefits children beyond our immediate community without directly rewarding us for accepting tainted money." The wisdom of her proposal resonated with everyone. By morning, Jackson had drafted a letter to Governor Lawrence outlining a matching fund for the territorial expansion program, anonymous donor, dedicated exclusively to establishing new family-centered homes for orphaned children. 3 days later, as Jackson was helping Benjamin install windows in the new workshop, a rider arrived with a telegram. He tore it open, expecting correspondence from Montgomery about the expansion program. Instead, he read, "Contribution doubled stop. Use wisely stop. Redemption costs more than expected. Stop, Victor Hayes." Jackson handed the telegram to Benjamin. "What do you make of this?" The young man studied it thoughtfully. "Seems like he's trying to buy his way to feeling better." "Perhaps," Jackson replied. "Or maybe he's finding his own path forward, same as the rest of us." Victor's unexpected contributions, whatever their motivation, would multiply the impact of Pine Ridge beyond anything Jackson had initially envisioned. From one desperate family in a cabin too small for its occupants, they had created a model that might eventually transform child welfare throughout the territory. Winter descended upon Pine Ridge with expected severity, but found a community well prepared for its challenges. The expanded main house, with its double-thickness walls and improved heating system, remained warm despite howling winds and deepening snow. Food stores proved abundant, supplemented by regular hunting expeditions led by Thomas and the older boys. The school continued uninterrupted, with Martha Thompson arriving 3 times weekly regardless of weather, determined that education should not be seasonal. Christmas approached with mounting excitement among the children. For many, it would be their first experience of the holiday celebrated properly, with adequate food, modest gifts, and genuine family atmosphere. Elizabeth organized preparations with characteristic efficiency, assigning specific responsibilities to each child according to age and ability. Sarah supervised decoration of the main house with pine boughs and handmade ornaments. Benjamin and the carpentry apprentices secretly produced wooden toys for the younger children. Emma managed the baking of traditional cookies and breads, filling the kitchen with aromas that drew even the most studious children from their lessons. Jackson found himself swept into these preparations with unexpected enthusiasm. The simple joy throughout the orphanage, awakening memories of childhood celebrations long buried after his parents' death. Nothing like the formal, obligatory appearances at business gatherings that had marked his adult Christmases. Samuel, now firmly established as Jackson's shadow, approached Christmas with philosophical questions that often left adults struggling for appropriate answers. "Why baby Jesus sleep with animals?" he inquired one evening as Jackson carved another wooden animal for the boys' growing collection. "Because there was no room at the inn," Jackson replied, reciting the familiar explanation. Samuel's brow furrowed, his small fingers tracing the half-carved wooden rabbit. "No room for baby? Like us before? Nobody want us?" The parallel struck Jackson forcefully. The displacement, the makeshift shelter, the unlikely family formed through circumstance rather than blood. "Yes," he acknowledged, "very much like us." Samuel's face brightened suddenly. "But we got big room now, lots and lots of room." He spread his arms wide to demonstrate the vastness of their current home. "We do," Jackson agreed, marveling at how the child consistently reduced complex situations to essential truths. "We have room enough for everyone who needs it." On Christmas Eve, snow fell in gentle persistence, blanketing the valley in pristine white. The entire community gathered in the main house for a celebration that blended traditions from multiple backgrounds. Elizabeth's Pennsylvania Dutch customs, Henry's Midwestern practices, even elements from Jackson's own half-forgotten childhood celebrations. The children performed a nativity pageant with varying degrees of stage fright. Lucy, once so silent, sang a clear solo that brought a hush over the audience. The twins, Matthew and Mark, argued in whispers over who would present which gift to the baby Jesus. Emma, normally so serious, giggled when the makeshift star caught in her hair. Sarah watched over it all with the intensity of a general commanding troops, while Benjamin's stable setting stood sturdy against the enthusiastic movements of young performers. Joshua's drawings transformed the dining hall into Bethlehem. His once charcoal sketches, now vibrant with colors from the paint set Jackson had ordered from Denver. Samuel, cast as the smallest shepherd, stood frozen when his moment came, staring wide-eyed at the audience until he spotted Jackson. Drawing a deep breath, he delivered his single line, "I bring a lamb for the baby king," with such heartfelt sincerity that even Thomas Elliot was seen to brush away unexpected moisture from his eyes. Dinner followed, a feast that represented the culmination of weeks of preparation. Turkey and venison, vegetables preserved from summer harvest, pies and puddings prepared according to recipes handed down through generations. The long tables accommodated 32 people, permanent residents and special guests alike, including Martha Thompson, Dr. Wilson, and Reverend Miller with his family. As the meal concluded, Henry rose to offer a toast, his weathered face illuminated by candlelight. "A year ago," he began, voice thick with emotion, "Elizabeth and I sat in a cabin too small for the children in our care, expecting to be separated by morning. Now we gather as a true family, with abundance beyond anything we could have imagined." He raised his glass of cider, "To unexpected blessings and to the man who made them possible, Jackson Thornton." Jackson found himself momentarily unable to respond as faces turned toward him with expressions ranging from Sarah's quiet respect to Samuel's unabashed adoration. This was perhaps the truest measure of his transformation, not the buildings constructed or systems established, but the human connections forged through shared purpose and genuine care. I think, he said finally, that we have all transformed each other. What exists here at Pine Ridge isn't my creation, it's our collective achievement. Later, as the younger children prepared for bed, animated by excitement for morning's promised gifts, Jackson found himself drawn to the veranda despite the cold. Snow continued to fall, muffling the world in silence broken only by occasional laughter from within the house. He thought of the journey that had brought him here, from wealthy businessman to reluctant benefactor to the man he had become. The transformation had not been without cost. His fortune was gone, his business reputation sacrificed, his former life abandoned. Yet standing here, watching snow gather on the buildings that housed 32 souls bound by choice rather than circumstance, Jackson could identify no regret. A small hand slipped into his, and he looked down to find Samuel beside him, wooden horse clutched in his free hand. "Santa comes soon," the boy informed him seriously. "Very soon," Jackson agreed, lifting the child to better see the snowfall. "You should be in bed." "Waiting for you, Samuel explained, resting his head against Jackson's shoulder with absolute trust. For story. It had become their nightly ritual, a story before sleep, usually involving the wooden horse's adventures. Tonight, however, Jackson felt moved to share something different. Once, he began, as they settled into Samuel's small bed, there was a man who thought he had everything because he owned many things. "Rich man," Samuel supplied, familiar with the concept from Bible stories. Yes, a rich man. But he was also a lonely man, although he didn't know it. Then one day he found a cabin in the woods with many children who needed help. "Like me," Samuel murmured, eyes growing heavy despite his excitement. "Like you," Jackson confirmed. And though the man didn't know how to help at first, he learned. And as he helped the children, something magical happened. "What happened?" Samuel asked, fighting sleep. "The children helped him too. They taught him about family and love and what truly matters. And the man who thought he had everything discovered he had been poor all along until he found those children." But Samuel had drifted into sleep, wooden horse clutched against his chest, expression peaceful and absolute security. Jackson remained seated on the edge of the small bed, watching the rise and fall of the child's breathing. 4 months ago, this boy had offered his wooden horse back, believing Jackson would leave like every other adult in his short life. Now he slept without fear, certain of continuity and care. This, then, was the true legacy of Pine Ridge, not buildings or programs, or even the territorial expansion now taking shape through Governor Lawrence's initiative. The legacy lived in Samuel's peaceful sleep, in Sarah's emerging confidence, in Benjamin's growing mastery, in Emma's determined pursuit of knowledge. It existed in Thomas Elliott's renewed dignity, in the community's gradual acceptance, in every life touched and transformed by what had begun as a desperate stand against separation. As snow continued to fall on the valley, Jackson Thornton, once defined by wealth, now measured by connection, understood at last the full meaning of redemption. It wasn't merely the rectification of past mistakes or compensation for former failures. Redemption was the transformation of loss into opportunity, of ending into beginning, of isolation into community. The wooden horse that had symbolized his initial commitment now represented something far more profound, a promise kept, a life changed, a future secured, not just for Samuel, but for every child who would find shelter at Pine Ridge, or the homes modeled after it throughout the territory. Jackson rose quietly, careful not to disturb the sleeping child. Tomorrow would bring Christmas celebration, followed by continued work building the community they had all created together. The path ahead held challenges, certainly, expansion to manage, new children to integrate, bureaucracy to navigate. But it also held immeasurable reward in lives reclaimed and purpose discovered. Jackson Thornton, the millionaire who had lost everything, had found something far more valuable in the process. Not just a family or a community, but his own humanity, buried beneath decades of calculated isolation. He paused at the dormitory door, looking back at Samuel's sleeping form. "Merry Christmas, son," he whispered, the word no longer unfamiliar on his tongue. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering Pine Ridge in pristine white, nature's own symbol of fresh beginnings and second chances. Redemption, Jackson reflected as he walked toward his own quarters, came in unexpected forms. Sometimes it arrived in the shape of a wooden horse, carved by hands unaccustomed to creating anything that couldn't be measured in dollars. Sometimes it looked exactly like home. Christmas morning dawned with a clarity that turned the snow-covered valley into a sea of diamonds. Jackson woke before sunrise, a habit from decades of business discipline that even his new life couldn't break. He stood at his window, watching the first golden light touch the eastern ridge, and found himself doing something he hadn't done since childhood, anticipating Christmas with genuine joy. The children's excited voices soon filled the main house. Jackson entered to find organized chaos as Sarah supervised the distribution of presents. Benjamin ensured the fire was properly stoked, and Emma helped the younger ones untie ribbons too complex for small fingers. Pa Jackson, look! Samuel raced toward him, holding up a hand-carved set of farm animals to complement his treasured horse. A whole family! So they are, Jackson agreed, kneeling to examine each piece. Your horse isn't alone anymore. The boy's eyes widened with understanding. Like us. From across the room, Sarah caught Jackson's gaze. At 15, she stood on the threshold of womanhood, already displaying the quiet strength that would define her adult years. She approached, holding a carefully wrapped package. We made this, she said, presenting it with uncharacteristic shyness. All of us. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with a simple pine tree. The first page bore the inscription, "To Jackson Thornton, who taught us that family can be chosen. Christmas, 1888. Turn the page, Sarah prompted. Each child had contributed. Drawings from Joshua, careful handwriting from Emma, documenting the orphanage's beginnings, pressed wildflowers from Lucy, even ink thumbprints from those too young to write. The final pages remained blank, waiting for future entries. For the story that's still being written, Sarah explained. Later that afternoon, as the celebration continued, a messenger arrived with a letter bearing the territorial governor's seal. Jackson excused himself to read it in the quiet of the library. Governor Lawrence had secured initial funding for 3 new homes based on the Pine Ridge model to be established by next autumn. The territorial legislature had approved the framework Jackson and Montgomery had designed. Independent oversight but minimal bureaucratic interference, family structure over institutional regimen. Jackson sat at the desk and opened the journal he'd received that morning. Dipping his pen, he began to write. Christmas Day, 1888. Today marks 1 year since I stood at a crossroads and chose a path I never imagined for myself. What began as 11 children in a cabin too small to hold them has become 23 children in a community that expands with each season. Soon this model will spread throughout the territory, offering hundreds of children what these few have found, not just shelter, but home. My fortune is gone, yet I've never been wealthier. My business reputation is ruined, yet I've never stood taller. My former life is abandoned, yet I've never felt more complete. He paused, hearing the sound of children's laughter floating through the doorway. From the window, he could see new cabins rising on the hillside. Homes for families like the Elliots who had joined their growing community. Jackson turned to the small table beside the desk, where he kept his few personal possessions. Among them was a faded photograph of his parents standing proudly before their Pennsylvania farm. He had carried it for 30 years, a reminder of loss. Now it felt like something else, a foundation upon which he had finally built something worthy. This, father, he whispered, is the true measure of a house. He returned to the celebration, the journal tucked under his arm, ready to add new pages to a story that would echo far beyond Pine Ridge Valley, redeeming not just one life, but generations to come.